When I open a hive to feed it now, I do not lift the inner cover. I peel back one corner, a patch about the size of my palm. A few seconds, and it drops back into place. The bees barely register it. No smoke is needed. And more to the point, the inside of that hive is never standing open to every robber within flight range during an August dearth. The reason I can do that is that 20 years ago I stopped using wooden inner covers and put a piece of cloth there instead. It sounds trivial. It changed how I open a hive more than any other single thing I have done. I want to be clear at the outset that this is not a miracle, and the bees do not care much either way. Colonies manage perfectly well under wooden covers everywhere in the world. What changed was my side of the transaction, and it changed enough that I have never gone back. The wooden inner cover is one of the least examined parts of the modern hive. It arrives with the equipment, everyone uses one, and it does not occur to most beekeepers that it is a choice at all. But it carries consequences that only become visible once you have worked without one. It seals hard. It opens all at once. It sits between the colony and the ceiling as a solid barrier, and every inspection begins with breaking it loose. None of that is unavoidable. It is simply what a flat board does. If this biology first breakdown is useful to you, a like helps more beekeepers find it. There is a particular blindness that attaches to components that arrive with the equipment. A thing you assemble yourself gets questioned. A thing that comes in the box gets treated as part of the definition of a hive, and the inner cover has spent a long time in that category, despite being one of the simplest parts to replace. Before any of the reasoning, here is something worth noticing on your next inspection, whether or not you ever change anything. Pay attention to the moment you crack the inner cover. Watch how much of the colony is exposed at once, how the bees respond in the first 3 seconds, and how long the hive stands fully open while you set the cover down and reach for a tool. Then, think about what that same moment looks like during a dearth, with several thousand foragers in the neighborhood looking for exactly the smell that just escaped. Most beekeepers have never counted the cost of that moment because it is the only way they have ever opened a hive. It is worth doing this once deliberately, with a stopwatch running in your head, because the honest answer is usually longer than the impression. Between cracking the cover, setting it down somewhere, picking up the tool and getting to the thing you came for, a hive can stand fully open for a good deal longer than the job required. The same exercise is worth repeating in October, because the cost of that open moment changes completely with the season, and most beekeepers carry a single mental figure for it all year. Before we go further, one small and genuine request. If this is useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps. It signals that careful, historically grounded beekeeping is worth showing to more people. In the comments, it would be good to know, have you ever used anything other than a wooden inner cover, and how did it go? And if you would like to support the work more directly, joining the channel is a little like buying us a coffee. No grand promises, just a way to help keep these breakdowns coming. That is all. Now, back to the bees. The answers tend to be more varied than for almost any other piece of equipment, which is itself informative. The material itself is nothing exotic, and that is rather the point. A piece of tightly woven cotton canvas, cut a little larger than the top of the box, laid directly across the top bars, and the outer cover set down on top of it. That is the whole arrangement. It is the sort of solution that comes from beekeeping traditions where equipment was made rather than bought, where a covering over the frames was whatever suitable material was to hand, and the job was understood as putting a breathable layer between the colony and the roof, rather than as installing a component. The specification is loose in every direction except one. Weight and weave matter, and everything else is preference. Cut it generously rather than exactly, because a cloth that sits a little proud of the box edges is easier to grip and peel than one trimmed flush, and the excess disappears under the outer cover anyway. Duck cloth and heavy canvas are the two names worth looking for, and the weight is what matters rather than the label. A piece that feels substantial in the hand, that you cannot easily push a finger through, and that does not let light through when held up, is about right. There is no cutting to tolerance, no hardware, no fastening, and nothing to fit. The cloth goes on the top bars, and the outer cover goes on the cloth, and that is the entire installation. What the bees do with it is the part that makes it work. Within a few weeks, they propolize the edges and the underside, and it stops being a loose cloth and becomes a fitted membrane sealed to the box on the colony's own terms. Heavy canvas that has been propolized is a very effective cover, and it is dense enough that small hive beetles cannot get through it. The colony has essentially manufactured its own inner cover to its own specification, in a material it can adjust, and it has done it without any help. That process takes a few weeks, and it is worth waiting for before forming a judgment. A brand new cloth laid on the top bars behaves nothing like a settled one. It shifts, it does not seal, and the bees walk over the edges as though it were not there. The version that works is the version they have finished. There is something worth appreciating in that arrangement. The colony is not adapting to a cover the beekeeper imposed. It is building its own to a specification it chose, out of a material it manufactures, on a surface that happens to be there. All the beekeeper supplied was the substrate. It is also why judging canvas on its first fortnight is unfair to it. Everything good about the arrangement depends on a seal the bees have not built yet. And that is where the advantage I actually care about comes from, because it is not really a property of the cloth at all. It is a property of what the bees turned the cloth into, and it is not available with a rigid cover, no matter how well it fits. A board can be well made, well fitted, and perfectly sized, and it will still only ever open one way, entirely. The cloth opens in whatever increment the beekeeper chooses, and that single difference is the reason I still have canvas on the hives 2 decades later. Because a propolized cloth can be opened partially in a way a board cannot. Peeling back one corner exposes a hand-sized area rather than the whole top of the hive. This is the single thing I would put to any beekeeper considering it. With cloth, you can peel back a corner to fill a feeder, which means less robbing and calmer bees with no smoke needed, whereas cracking a wooden inner cover leaves the bees far less pleased and exposes a much larger area to attract robbers. Every advantage in that sentence is behavioral rather than structural, and every one of them matters most in exactly the weeks when a hive is most vulnerable. I did not anticipate any of this when I first tried it. I was thinking about moisture and expected the access to be roughly equivalent. The access turned out to be the whole point, and the moisture turned out to be the secondary consideration, which is close to the reverse of what I had assumed. The reason it matters so much in a dearth is arithmetic rather than sentiment. A full opening exposes the entire top of the colony and releases the scent of everything inside it into an apiary where several thousand foragers are actively searching for exactly that. A palm-sized opening for a few seconds does not. The difference compounds through a season. A quick corner check to see whether a feeder needs refilling, whether the bees have moved up into a super, whether there is activity at the top bars. All of that becomes a 10-second operation that barely disturbs anything, and things you would otherwise put off until a full inspection get done casually and often. The threshold for looking drops, and a lower threshold for looking is worth a great deal in a craft where most mistakes come from not having looked. There is a version of this that applies to inspection frequency more broadly, which I have covered elsewhere. Most of the value in looking at a colony comes from looking often enough to notice change, and most of the cost comes from the disturbance of a full opening. Anything that separates those two, that lets you look without fully opening, is buying information at a discount. The practical version is that things I would previously have deferred now get checked in passing. Whether a feeder is empty, whether the bees have moved up, whether there is anything unusual happening at the top bars, none of those justify a full inspection on their own, and all of them are worth knowing. The second effect is about moisture. And here I want to be careful, because this connects to a subject where beekeepers genuinely disagree, and I have covered both sides of it before. Cloth is breathable in a way a board is not. Water vapor produced by the cluster can pass through it rather than meeting a cold, impermeable ceiling directly above the bees, and a number of beekeepers use fabric covers specifically because they let moisture escape in winter. That places canvas firmly in one of the two legitimate schools of winter moisture management, the one that gives the vapor a route out, rather than the one that keeps the ceiling warm enough that it never condenses in the first place. I am not going to relitigate that argument here, beyond saying that the mechanism is real in both directions. Vapor that passes through a permeable ceiling is vapor that is not condensing on a cold board directly above the cluster and dripping back down onto it, which is the specific failure that kills colonies in winter. The relevant point for anyone weighing canvas specifically is that it commits you to one of the two approaches by its nature. A permeable cover is a ventilation answer, whether or not you thought of it that way, and pairing it with a management style built around the opposite assumption is where the trouble comes from. Both approaches work, and both have serious practitioners behind them. What matters is not choosing the correct one, but avoiding the arrangement that belongs to neither. A sealed, impermeable ceiling with no insulation above it, which is the default configuration of a great many hives and is the worst of the available options. Canvas is a coherent answer. It is not the only coherent answer, and a beekeeper running heavy top insulation with a sealed cover is doing something equally defensible for different reasons. What I would say is that a beekeeper should know which of the two they are doing, because the failure mode of doing both halfway is worse than either done properly. Cloth under heavy sealed insulation with nowhere for the vapor to go is a recipe for a wet cover, which is exactly the mold problem I will come to shortly. The version that fails is almost always a hybrid assembled by accident, rather than either method applied deliberately. Now the honest part, because canvas has real drawbacks, and I have run into all of them. It does not last. Fabric covers frequently do not survive more than 2 seasons in regular use, and they need replacing rather than repairing. Bees chew holes in them, particularly at the edges, and a cloth with a hole in it is doing nothing useful. And in the wrong conditions, they can hold moisture rather than passing it. Cloth that gets wet and does not dry out will mold, which is a genuine failure mode reported by beekeepers running fabric with a lot of insulation above it in cold climates. 2 seasons is a genuinely short service life for a piece of equipment, and it is the honest cost of the approach. It is cheap enough that replacement is not a burden, but it is a recurring task rather than a one-time purchase. And a beekeeper who dislikes recurring tasks will find that irritating in a way that outweighs the benefits. It is also worth saying that some beekeepers get considerably longer out of them than 2 seasons, depending on climate, colony temperament, and fabric weight. So the figure is a working expectation rather than a rule. Set against a wooden cover that lasts a working lifetime, that is the clearest disadvantage on the list, and the one I would want anyone to weigh honestly before switching. There is a second practical annoyance that nobody mentions until you have lived with it. The propolizing that makes the cloth work also makes it stick, and a heavily propolized canvas can be firmly glued down around the edges. Peeling back a corner stays easy because you are working with a small area and the fabric flexes. Removing the whole thing for a full inspection sometimes is not easy at all, and it does not come away as cleanly as a board levered off with a hive tool. That is the actual trade being made, a much easier partial opening in exchange for a slightly more awkward full one, which is a good bargain if you open partially often and fully rarely, and a poor one if your pattern is the reverse. The workaround, once you know it, is simply to plan for it. A full inspection starts by running a hive tool around the perimeter first, rather than pulling at a corner and tearing the fabric. Knowing that in advance turns a frustration into a procedure, which is most of what experience amounts to in this craft. Choosing the material matters more than it sounds, and getting it wrong is where most people's first attempt fails. It needs to be tightly woven and heavy. Lightweight cotton is chewed through quickly, and loose weave lets beetles and moths pass. Untreated is essential. Nothing waterproofed, nothing flame-treated, nothing that was printed or coated, and nothing that has held anything you would not want in a hive. Feed sacks are a common improvisation, and a genuinely risky one if the seed inside was treated with anything, which is worth knowing before reaching for the obvious free option. The cost of getting this wrong is a season rather than a disaster, but it is a season, and most people who try canvas once and abandon it did so because the first piece they used was too light. The rule I use is that if I would not put the material in contact with food, it does not go on a hive. That excludes most of the free options, which is inconvenient and correct. There is a variation worth knowing about that solves the chewing problem directly. Some beekeepers put a layer of mesh above or below the cloth, which stops the bees working holes through it while leaving the fabric doing its job. The same idea appears in moisture quilt construction, where the canvas floor is sometimes replaced with hardware cloth precisely because the wire keeps the bees from chewing through. If your first canvas cover comes back with holes in it after one season, that is the fix rather than a heavier fabric. It is a small enough modification that it is worth building in from the start rather than waiting to discover the problem, particularly in an apiary that has had wax moth or beetle pressure before. The mesh also solves a second problem quietly, which is that it holds the fabric flat and stops the bees working the edges up, so the cloth stays where it was put. None of this makes canvas the right answer for every operation, and I would not want anyone to change equipment on the strength of one video. It suits a beekeeper working a modest number of hives who inspects reasonably often and values quick, low-disturbance access. It suits an apiary where robbing pressure is a real seasonal problem. It suits less well an operation moving hives regularly, where a solid board is simply more robust. And it suits less well anyone who would rather replace nothing for a decade than replace something cheap every second year. The honest summary is that this is a preference rather than an upgrade. Beekeepers I respect use both, and the ones who stay with wooden covers are not overlooking something obvious. If your hives are in one place, you look at them often, and August robbing pressure is a real problem where you are. The case is strong. Outside that, it is genuinely optional. The two questions worth asking yourself honestly are how often you open a hive for something small, and whether robbing is a real problem in your apiary in late summer. If the answer to both is yes, the case is strong. If either is no, the wooden cover is doing fine. What I find interesting about it is what it says about the equipment we inherit. The wooden inner cover is not a solution someone arrived at after weighing the alternatives. It is what fits a manufactured hive sold as a complete unit, and it's standardized for that reason, rather than because it was better at the job. Beekeepers who made their own coverings put whatever suitable material they had over the frames, and the bees turned it into a fitted cover themselves. That approach produced a working solution with real advantages that most of us have never tried, because a board came in the box. That is a pattern worth noticing generally, because it applies to a good deal of standard equipment. The thing that became standard is usually the thing that fitted the manufacturing and distribution model, and whether it was the best answer to the actual problem is a separate question that mostly never got asked. None of that is a criticism of the manufacturers, who make what sells and sell what fits the system. It is an observation about how defaults form, and about how rarely anyone goes back and checks them. The partial opening in particular is worth dwelling on, because it changes something that is not really about equipment at all. Every full opening of a hive during a dearth is a broadcast. The scent of the colony released across an apiary of foragers with nothing to forage. That is the mechanism behind a good deal of the robbing that beekeepers accidentally start. And it is why the standard advice during a dearth is short inspections, nothing spilled, and as little exposure as possible. A cover that can be opened a palm's width at a time is an equipment answer to a behavioral problem, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. It is also one of the few equipment changes I can think of that reduces risk rather than adding capability. Most things a beekeeper buys let them do something new. This one lets them do something they were already doing while exposing less of the colony while they do it. That is worth weighing against the 2-season service life, because the risk it reduces is concentrated in exactly the weeks when a mistake is most expensive. Very little equipment in beekeeping does that, and it is worth recognizing when something does. I should also say plainly that the cloth is not doing anything the colony could not do without it. Bees manage perfectly well under wooden inner covers all over the world, and no colony has ever failed because it had a board over the frames instead of canvas. The advantages here are almost entirely to the beekeeper. Quicker access, less disturbance imposed, a lower threshold for looking, a smaller opening during robbing season. Those are real, and they are worth having. But the honest framing is that this is a tool that makes the beekeeper better rather than a change that makes the colony healthier. I mention it because there is a tendency in this craft to frame every preference as a welfare argument, and this one genuinely is not. It is a convenience that happens to have a safety benefit attached during robbing season, and that is enough of a case without inflating it into something else. Overclaiming is how a genuinely useful small practice gets dismissed by people who tried it, found it did not transform anything, and concluded the whole thing was nonsense. For anyone wanting to try it, the whole experiment costs almost nothing. Get heavy, untreated cotton canvas or duck cloth, cut it a couple of inches larger than the top of the box on each side, lay it directly on the top bars, and put the outer cover on. Try it on 1 or 2 hives rather than the whole yard. Give the bees a few weeks to propolize the edges before judging it, because a fresh cloth and a settled one behave completely differently. If it comes back chewed, add mesh. And keep the wooden covers, because you will want them if you decide the trade is not for you. Give it a full season before deciding, and pay particular attention to how it behaves in the 2 conditions that matter most: a hot dearth week when robbing pressure is high, and the first properly cold spell of winter. 2 hives is enough to form a view, and running them alongside wooden covers on the rest of the row gives you the comparison that actually answers the question for your own conditions. The thing that kept me using them was never the moisture argument, which I could take or leave, and it was certainly not saving the price of a board. It was that peeling back a corner instead of opening a hive turned out to change how often I looked and how much I disturbed when I did. Have you ever used anything other than a wooden inner cover? And if you have, did the bees end up gluing it down harder than you expected? Leave your experience in the comments. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping, and if you want the full breakdown of what actually keeps a winter cluster dry and why the ceiling matters more than the floor, that one is next. The moisture argument and the cost argument are both real, and neither would have kept me using it on its own. It was the corner. It is a small change with a narrow benefit, and I would not have believed how much difference a narrow benefit makes when it applies to something done several hundred times a season.